All right, without further ado, I'd like to welcome one of my best friends in the whole world, and certainly a guy, if there ever was an Indiana Jones type of researcher, this guy is that person. He travels all over the U.S. When I call him on the phone, the first thing is I say, "Where are you today?" And he could be deep in the swamp, he could be in some haunted location. He's boots on the ground, and he's done so much research in the field, and he's also studied this subject pretty much his whole life. So he brings a lot of expertise and knowledge to the subject, and we're very happy to have him here in Fouke today. First appearance at the Fouke Monster Festival. Please welcome David Weatherly.
Good afternoon, Fouke. How's everybody doing? Great. So, I realized when my buddy Rob was up here speaking that, gosh, I didn't put a bunch of slides in here with gratuitous selfies and pictures about my background, and then I started thinking, do people really know who I am? So, just a couple things as way of biography. I started doing this stuff in the 1970s, and that's where you all go, no way, he doesn't look that old. I didn't have gray hair until I had teenagers. A lot of you probably understand that. But a lot of the influences Rob talked about influenced me too. I grew up hearing ghost stories from my family. I have one brother who's 10 years older, so I pretty much grew up as an only child because he'd already moved out when I was really getting interested in these kind of things. And bear in mind, again, this is the 1970s. This was not cool or hip. You mentioned Bigfoot or haunted places and UFOs, and people were like, "Now, what's wrong with this guy?" So I always tell the joke that, you know, back in those days, if I went to a party, I was guaranteed a nice quiet evening alone as soon as people found out what I did. These days, it's kind of the opposite because people find out what I do and there's a line out the door because everybody has a story, and it's changed and it's really cool now because people are more comfortable. Those stories have always been there, but it's just that the level of comfort is now here so that people can share these accounts, a lot of them going back far in their family's history. So, as far as myself, I've written quite a few books on a wide range of things, from haunted locations to cryptids. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those today. And you may have seen me on a few television shows. I've been on Mysteries of the Outdoors, Mysteries of the National Parks, Beyond Belief, On the Trail of UFOs, Ancient Aliens. Anyway, I really love what I do, and one of my approaches is that I like to really kind of follow the trail, so to speak. I knew John Keel when I was younger, before he passed away, and he was a big influence on me. His approach was very journalistic. You know, he would go out in the field, he would talk to people, and he would kind of dig into these legends and these things that were happening, and that's how I've always approached this. So, as I continue today, I'm talking about southern wild men and Bigfoot legends. It's actually a very big topic, and it bears a couple of points of clarity right at the beginning here. Now, if you're blessed enough to have been born in the South, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say the South. But for the benefit of any Yankees, I hope the mayor's not in here, but curiously enough, when you look up, if you Google the South, the southern states, you get a wide range of varieties, different maps. And it was kind of mind-boggling when I saw this. Like, people, I guess, aren't completely clear on exactly what the traditional South is. Traditionally, the South would be all of these states, plus Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. Oklahoma at that point, most old maps you'll see it's marked as Indian Territory because Oklahoma wasn't a state until much, much later. A lot of people now commonly consider it part of the American South. In terms of wild men, these are legends that go pretty far back in history. We're talking early European accounts. This is an early depiction of a knight battling a wild man. They were also called a woodloose, a wild man of the woods, and accounts go back to about the 12th century in Europe. We see this term carry over to the New World, so that early accounts in America when they're talking about figures kind of like this, they will refer to them as wild men, sometimes spelled a singular wild man. This is another depiction. This is from the 15th century. And this is a courtly lady taming a wild man. Now, you look at this figure, bear in mind, 15th century. I mean, what does it look like to you guys? This is very close to a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. And in fact, it's interesting to see as this image evolves over the years, how many similarities there are. A lot of the early depictions, you'll see the wild man holding a stick or a staff, sometimes it's a club. And it's important to emphasize how long this has been in the consciousness, particularly of Europeans, but of course in America too. The definition, specifically of wild man, and I promise I didn't make this up if you skip ahead and see the last one. You look this up and it says, definition of a wild man is a person who is not socialized, an uncivilized man or savage, a feral man, or a man holding radical political views. Yeah. So here are some other depictions of the wild man or the woodloose. I particularly like this one from 40 and Times because I think it shows very clearly how this has evolved into our modern depictions of Bigfoot. And it's not too far of a leap to look at recent artistic depictions and see the similarities. The shaggy appearance. Here's my cover artist did this on the first volume holding a stick because we constantly hear these reports of wood knocking. And you'll believe that these creatures hold a stick or a cudgel and bang it against trees to make that sound. So following this trail, this is the general areas I'm going to touch on today as we talk about southern wild men. And I'll point out that these wild men accounts, they're found all over the United States. I've heard these accounts in the Southwest desert. I've heard them in the Pacific Northwest. You go back in history and you can find these early accounts all over the place. It really begins with Native American legends because, as Jerry mentioned this morning, Native tribes all over the country have these legends. They all have a name for the hairy man or the savage or the wild man that's specific to their language, and it always translates roughly like that. So these legends were already there when Europeans came to the country, and they heard these stories. They kind of blended in with some of the folklore that they brought with them from Europe. So we get this unique blend that people recognize, oh, this is just like the old wild man stories. So early accounts, that's very much what we hear. We go to early news sources, and there are lots of accounts of wild men or savages. They didn't call it Bigfoot. Bear in mind, this is a much earlier period. We're talking about 17 and 1800s, even into the early 1900s. And we'll touch on the news sources in a moment. And then, of course, there are modern accounts. Now, what fascinates me, in particular, something I'll try to point out today, is looking at these accounts in particular areas that go far back in history. There are modern accounts, modern sightings, but when you start following that trail backwards, you'll find that the region has a folklore or a tradition, maybe a particular named creature. You go even further back, and guess what? The native tribes in that region, they have stories. Case in point, one of the most fascinating early stories. Anybody recognize this by chance? Here's a legend trip for you. This is Judicula Rock in western North Carolina. Now this rock, here's a more recent picture of it. This rock was already there and already marked when the Cherokees were in that region. Now that's their territory. They have legends about this rock. If you notice this pattern right here, the Cherokees believed that this was a handprint. It has 7 fingers or talons, and the Cherokee legend about this rock is that it was connected to their giant. their savage or hairy man. Archaeologists have been puzzled about this thing for a very long time. They have documented the soapstone, the same soapstone that the rock is carved on, has been used in the area at least 1,500 years ago. But they're saying that activity at this site is at least 3,000 years old. They don't know who made the markings. They can't interpret the markings. But scientists, archaeologists are convinced that these are not just random marks, that they are specifically written messages or notations about something. They don't have an explanation. But of course, again, the Native Americans do. Now, you hear this time and time again around the country that, the modern scientists will come in and they'll try to figure something out, and they'll dismiss all the early cultures' stories and tales. No, that's superstition. It doesn't have anything to do with that. But then, in recent years, we often hear that those old, quote, superstitions or folk tales have a basis in truth, because it all sort of winds together. The Native Americans say that Judakula, and here's some depictions of this creature, was a giant that lived in Cherokee's territory. He was so massive that he could jump from mountain to mountain. He had 7 fingers or talons. Sometimes he's seen as being more like the middle depiction here, sort of the Lord of the Hunt. It's kind of a Celtic style motif almost. But then other depictions, he's depicted much more like a Sasquatch type creature. And the artist here, of course, chose to show him again with a club, like we see often. This creature, the Cherokees call him Sukalu. And through the clever lack of ability to pronounce Cherokee words from early settlers, it morphed into Judakula. Sometimes you hear it as Judakula, but it essentially is the same creature. And this site, it attracts people from all over the world. The stone, incidentally, is about 40 feet in diameter. And it just, it's really something to see. It's in Jackson County, North Carolina. If you ever get a chance to make the trip. It's one of the few things I think we have that clearly shows us physical evidence connected to a really, really old Bigfoot account. This is a giant. These stories, the Cherokee talked about them for a long time. In another region of North Carolina, an area called Bald Mountain. 1793, there's a report in a newspaper about an encounter with these creatures. Now, you see some of the descriptions here. They had large, hairy feet, large eyes and nose, 6-inch long hair that stood up on their heads. Another term that the natives use, Chikikudli, is roughly how that is pronounced. Here's a quote from the news story. The animal is between 12 and 15 feet high and is shaped resembling a human being, except the head, which is in equal proportion to its body and draws in somewhat like a terrier. Now, initially, what happens when you hear that account and you think, okay, this is kind of out there, none of these creatures are drawing their heads in. However, if you look at that objectively and recall, one of the common themes you hear in Bigfoot accounts is what? That they have no neck. So, what does that kind of look like, especially maybe to an early settler or a native person? Maybe they thought, oh, this thing has a neck, it's just able to draw its head in somewhat. I think the fact that it's talking about hair standing up on its head is also kind of interesting because, again, there's the connection with the sagittal crest that we hear so much about. Other terms for these giants, Munui, the stone man, Chikikudli translates to hairy savage, roughly. These things were seen as being very fierce. We're sort of in that blend of wild man territory again, and the Cherokee in North Carolina said that these creatures, Judakula or Sukalu in particular, was extremely aggressive, that he would not allow any of the natives to hunt on his territory. that he would kill them if they came on his land. There are areas, there are spots in the mountains that they call them a bald, where there's just no vegetation, there's nothing growing there. And the old stories of the Cherokee would say that that is because Sukalu cleared that spot to farm, to plant crops. Sometimes you'll hear, oh, it's clear because Sukalu jumped and landed in that spot and it killed everything that was there. So we hear these stories. There are accounts from early North Carolina that settlers encountered these things. There's actually a short piece about a gun battle that reportedly took place with them. But again, we get into territory where we have to wonder, all right, where's the folklore, where's the native legend, and where's the reality? The Cherokee stories go all over the southern region. They go from North Carolina all the way down into parts of South Carolina and Georgia. There's another interesting legend out of Georgia, and it involves these creatures they call the slant-eyed giants. Now, the Cherokee in that region, they didn't view them quite as aggressively. They said that a group of giants came from the direction in which the sun goes down, and they visited the Cherokee in that region. When the giants showed up, the Cherokee treated them in a friendly manner. They took them in, they shared food with them, despite how imposing they probably looked. As you see from the description here, these things were described as being twice the size of normal men. Now I always point out to people that, you have to recall, this is earlier times. This is probably dates back to the 16 or 1700s, and people were a little bit shorter back then. So if you're looking at someone averaging 5 feet or so, then we're looking at creatures that are in the 8 to 10 foot range. And their eyes purportedly slanted back on their heads in a strange manner, which is where the term came from, sumu kalu, which is essentially a slant-eyed person. But on this particular mountain in Georgia, Blood Mountain, there's another story about the Nunahe. Now these are supposed to be immortals. And this area, Blood Mountain itself, the gruesome name reportedly comes from a battle that took place long, long ago between the Creeks and the Cherokees. And the Cherokees apparently won the contest and took control of the mountain, so it's very sacred to them. But they say that this race of immortals lives up on Blood Mountain. And this race of immortals, again, they're described very much like these slant-eyed giants. They're supposed to be very large beings. They're more benign. There are stories, there are legends about them helping lost hunters, lost travelers that came into the mountain and got in a difficult situation without food or water. So there are various stories that creep in, but one of the fascinating things about this is that the native people say this tribe of immortals, they drum. And their drumming echoes down the mountain and can be heard all over the region. And I've talked to some of the people who speak of this legend. It's very curious because I always ask, is this a rhythmic, long drumming, or is it short? Well, it's short, and it's usually a bum, bum, bum. And it has a very wooden sound. So again, what do we start to sound like there? The traditional wood knocking that is often associated with Sasquatch sightings. This region of Georgia, I find it particularly fascinating. I've spent a lot of time up there recently. This is just a random shot. That's not Blood Mountain, it's a different area. But it is such a rich territory for these creatures. There's a couple of other shots here. Kind of shows some of the resources. There are lots of waterfalls, fresh water. It's really very much sort of an alpine climate, which I find interesting when we go back to the wild man tradition again. It's funny, I spoke to a gentleman recently who lives in this region, and we've all met these guys. You know, his first comment was, well, I don't believe in Bigfoot. No such thing. I said, okay, well, you know, why don't you think it could exist? Well, I've hunted for 40 years. I know every animal in the forest. I've never seen it. I've never seen it. Never seen any sign of it. I've never seen one of these creatures. If it was out there, I would have seen it. There's been months I've hunted almost every day of the month. So, continue to have a conversation with him, and then ran over the course of 2 or 3 conversations. About the 3rd conversation, we started talking about just strange things in general. And I said, you know, you've hunted a lot. I said, have you ever seen or experienced anything kind of strange in the woods? And he said, well, no, not really. And I could see he was sort of thinking about it. He said, you know, there was something kind of strange when I was young. I was just a boy. I was with a friend of mine. We were in this area. He told me where it was. I won't specify at the moment. But he said, yeah, we were in the woods, and we heard something moving, but we didn't see it. And he said, now I want to say that my friend, he could always outrun me. And he said, I was never able to beat that boy in a race or a foot race or anything else. He said, but that day, as we were back there in the woods, he said, something let out this scream that scared the hell out of us. And I beat that boy running that day. He says, all I knew was all I had to do was be faster. So he proceeds to describe this thing and the sound, and I said, and I kind of knew where this was going. I'm sure you all do too at this point. I said, so you think it was a bobcat or a mountain lion? He said, no. He said, I've seen, he said, my daddy raised a bobcat. I know exactly what they sound like. I said, okay. I said, well, you know, there's a lot of panther legends. Wasn't a panther. So I've heard those. So he describes the sound again. I asked him a few questions. And I said, you know, there's a lot of stories about these Sasquatch emitting these blood-curdling screams. He just went kind of pale. And he said, oh, well, okay, maybe there's something out there. So, you know, I think sometimes people just get really focused on one belief or another. And they start getting so centered on that, they ignore a lot of other things that have happened. And I hear these kind of stories all the time from people who have hunted or been outdoorsmen for years and years and never experienced anything, but then suddenly one day, you know, something just changes their mind. So anyway, that's a little bit of some of the native traditions, and we'll touch on a couple more. But I want to address for a moment something we've all probably learned a lot about in the past year, and that's fake news. The newspapers of the 17 and 1800s are so frequently cited as being just fake news. I hear this from skeptics all the time. You start pointing out historical accounts, and people say, no, the skeptics in particular will say, you know, back in that day, they made up all this stories. It was all just fabricated. This period is where the term yellow journalism came from, and this is the definition of yellow journalism. It is journalism that exploits, distorts, or exaggerates the news to create sensation and attract readers. It's journalism which is sensationalistic and of questionable accuracy or taste. And it presents little or no legitimate research news, instead uses eye-catching headlines for increased sales and attention. Anybody think this applies to news today? Maybe a little. There's one other category. Sometimes things are reported before all the facts are verified. This is probably the most famous incident of that. I don't know if anybody's aware of this or not, but this really happened. 1948 election, Chicago Daily Tribune, they blasted out a headline, Dewey defeats Truman. Who remembers who Dewey is? Not many people. Now, the newspapers of the period, they did fabricate stories. There's no doubt about it. Go back to the 1800s. Here's a factual news story. about life on the moon. I don't know why we haven't counted these guys on any of the moon landings, but it's a great example of the fact that, yeah, fake news is definitely around. It's always been around when it comes to Bigfoot. I think the one in my favorite is, in the middle is my favorite, Bigfoot versus aliens. It was captured on home video. Somebody find this guy. Weekly World News, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that just because it's always a good laugh. Notable has the world's only reliable newspaper. Could even be true these days. There's actually a fine line between fact and fake when it comes to a lot of these news stories. Even tabloids get it right sometimes. I wrote a book last year about Indiana, and there's a whole cryptid account in there, really weird story about something called the oil pit squids. Anybody from Indiana? Familiar with the story? You guys from Indiana? Have you heard that story? It's out of Anderson, Indiana. Got blasted out on the tabloids, but it was a real story. So, yeah, sometimes they get it right, and guess what? Historically, they get it right all the time. Here's just a few headlines I grabbed. The loss of the Titanic, gold rush, assassination of President Lincoln, and this one is great. Maniac in Milwaukee shoots Colonel Roosevelt. He ignores the wound, speaks for an hour, and goes to the hospital. That's a true story. Roosevelt was giving a speech, he got shot, and he just kind of shook it off and kept speaking for an hour. Then he was done, he said, okay, we can go to the hospital and check this out, remove the bullet or whatever. I mean, that's just mind-boggling.
Yep. For those who are signed up for the 2 o'clock tour, go ahead and get ready for that. So we're going to get people signed up for the 2 o'clock tour ready to go on that. And also a quick note, please be respectful for the presentations going on. If you're in the back, please keep the talking to a minimum and head back over to David. So again, 2 o'clock is ready to go. If you're signed up for that, don't miss it.
It's hard not to feel like it's something I said. So, so my point is, a lot of these early papers, despite the skeptics loudly proclaiming, no, it's all those stories are fake, it's all fake news. No, it's just like, honestly, it's just like journalism of today. Some of it's complete BS, some of it is fact. And, as individuals, we have to kind of read these accounts, especially if we're doing historical research. We have to go back and look at these accounts and understand that the lines often get very blurred, especially when we look at things that are of a stranger nature, like cryptids. The common terms for these creatures in the United States even, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti. This is Roger Patterson's book. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this or have seen it. That is Roger Patterson of the Patterson-Gimlin film. He wrote a book about Sasquatch in America. What did he title it? The Abominable Snowmen of America, really is this. So these terms, I remember the 70s, I heard these constantly. Bigfoot and Sasquatch were the common terms, and you would hear Yeti frequently, even though that is very specific to the Himalayan sightings. You have to really look at the trail and look at the folklore and understand that those terms, we sometimes have to remove those if we're digging into historical sightings to understand that these creatures, they were described differently sometimes because Bigfoot, that term wasn't thrown around for a long time after a lot of these accounts. This particular depiction right here of the Sasquatch, this was done based on a sighting that I had in 1981 in the Great Dismal Swamp. Great Dismal Swamp is on the border of North Carolina and Virginia. And as a kid, I spent a lot of time in the Dismal Swamp. In hindsight, it was probably very stupid because I constantly tromp back there, and it's a quagmire of moccasins and rattlesnakes and everything else you can imagine. But I went in the swamp all the time, and I saw a creature in there. It was at nighttime under a full moon. It was standing against a tree, sort of like this. He was actually a little bit further out on the side here, so that it initially looked like a pair of trees when I saw it. And if I have time at the end of this presentation, and if you guys are interested, I can tell you more about the sighting. But the point of that is that the Great Dismal Swamp, at the time, there weren't any Bigfoot stories out of there. Nobody talked about Bigfoot in the swamp, but there were strange things back there. The southern swamps, they're frequently a hotbed of strange tales. This is one of my favorites. This came out of Milledgeville. This is in Georgia. And it involves initially a strange island that the Creek Indians said was in the middle of the Okefenokee. Now this island, it was supposed to be inhabited by beautiful women, which oddly enough attracted a lot of settlers. But the kicker was that their husbands were said to be giants and were very fierce and would kill anyone who intruded in their territory. So there's an account that shows up. This got printed in the newspapers. It starts off in 1829 with a trio of people looking for this island in the swamp, and they discover tracks 18 inches long, 9 inches wide, human in shape. They leave the swamp thinking, no, this is whatever this is. Maybe it's these warriors, maybe it's something else, but it's not worth the risk. So they hightailed it out. The story starts to spread, however, and eventually a group of hunters show up from Florida. 9 men. They listen to the tale. They say, we're going to go find this thing and see what it is. According to the story, these hunters trekked back into the swamp in pursuit of this creature. They eventually made camp, and just as they settled down for the evening, they heard something rustling in the trees. 2 of the men pulled up their rifles. In a moment, this massive creature charged out into the group. The men fired. This creature kept coming anyway. It tore into these men. The news account claims that this creature killed 5 of the men, mostly by twisting their heads off and just leaving them. Constant hail of bullets on this thing finally brought it down. The men, the surviving men, were so disturbed that the news account says they picked up their companions' rifles and left the swamp. Clearly didn't think about taking the bodies or anything else. So, is this story real? Well, this is probably an example of the creative reporting of the time. However, there may be some grain of truth somewhere in it. The problem is that for something so dramatic to have happened, there surely would have been more reports, more documentation. None of the names are ever mentioned of the hunters. The gentleman who related the story is a man named John Osteen. Here's a gentleman in historical records by that name that I found. But very little else about the story. Like I said, no follow-up. The Vermont Patriot and State Gazette tells us the story of this report is matter of fact, and the truth of it is accredited. This is common language of the day. I don't know who accredited it. I'd like to know, but you know, we're left with again a very fascinating tale, and it's sort of is part of where this dovetails from native tradition to modern folklore with this type of storytelling. But we can't deny that this region of the swamp, there are lots and lots of sightings. Another account out of Coney County, South Carolina. This is an interesting region to me. This is close to where Blood Mountain is over in Georgia, northern Georgia, and borders western North Carolina, where the Judicula stories come out. This Arcona County story came from a group of Native Americans who had a hunting party set up by the river. And these men They were hunting for several days. They would bring their kills back to the camp and leave them there, leave the next day. Their deer kept disappearing. I guess they weren't very happy about this. So they left an older man to guard the camp and to see what was stealing the deer. This is what he sees: a 7-foot-tall creature covered with hair, walking erect like a man. Its mouth was in the chin, and it had great claws on the fingers and toes. The native group panicked when they heard this. The creature had grabbed the deer, took off in the woods, moving extremely fast, and the natives decided not to pursue it. They reported it to a settlement nearby, and a hunting party from that town came out, searched the region, and tried to find this creature, but didn't turn anything up. You look at these southern regions, and there's a whole wide range of names that we hear. I mentioned earlier that, of course, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the common names now, but you look regionally, and this is just a few. I'm sure you guys have heard some that aren't on the list. Yahoo, booger, there's different terms, different versions of that. Wood booger, woolly booger, swamp man. One of my favorites I heard was corn burger. So this corn burger was told to me by some moonshiners. They called this creature that, again, the Great Dismal Swamp. And they said that they would have their stills set up deep in the swamp, and something would come in and tear their operation up and steal the corn, the corn mass that they were using. So I guess the creatures in the Dismal Swamp really like to shine. Getting into some wild men accounts, and again, this is a big territory, focusing just on the south even. So I'll just hit on a few that are particularly interesting. This is Laclede County, 1870, Missouri. The description: it had an ape-like head, only 2 legs, the body and legs covered with a thick coat of hair. The animal ran away very fast. It kept an upright position and appears more like a human, with the exception of the hair and color, which was dark brown. Anybody heard of the Tennessee Wild Man? So these stories made the rounds. He was described as being 7 feet tall, dark gray hair, piercing red eyes, a horrible smell, aggressive behavior, and he emitted a disturbing war cry, as they called it. He was plaguing this area in 1871, and there are a whole range of these accounts. And this is one of the areas that I believe we're looking at a real story that was reported, is often dismissed, but there's a lot of newspapers that reported on the Tennessee Wild Man. There's a lot of people in that region who have family stories talking about, a relative encountered this thing, a friend of a relative, all these different stories. And it sort of plagued the areas for a while. These are some random quotes out of some of the stories. He shuns the sight of men, but approaches with wild and horrid delight every woman who is unaccompanied by a man. This is kind of typical flowery writing of the day to make it a bit more dramatic. Should he see a man, he runs away with astonishing swiftness, leaping the tallest fences with the ease of a deer, defying alike the pursuit of men and dogs. And lastly, he has frightened several women by attempting to carry them off. I guess it wasn't moonshine that he was looking for. Florida has lots of stories. Again, going right from native legends, dovetailing into early historical accounts and right into modern accounts. I know Rob mentioned earlier the number of sightings in Florida is very, very high. The Creek and Seminole Nations both talk about these things. And again, we see the same pattern. So they call this thing Estichukpo, roughly translates as tall person. And they say these creatures live deep in the swamps, that they have a habit of slapping the tree as they go through. But again, you listen to these native stories, and they don't describe something that sounds like necessarily a hand slapping a tree like we would think of. I think it's again related to this whole wood knock habit that these creatures have. Here's a couple of historical reports. Wild man at San Pedro Bay, covered with hair, wild and fleet as a buck. Again, at the sight of humans, he flees into the swamp and disappears. Ocala, 1873. This creature was seen in Scott's Cave, covered with stiff white hair. Mississippi, 1917. Wild man seen near Walnut Grove by men cutting timber. This one was only 4 feet tall, but looked like a man, had a shaggy beard. And this is something, again, from a lot of the early accounts. You see this transition that happens between the reports from, I'll say pre-Bigfoot, meaning the modern term, to going back to these early accounts. They always refer to these things as wild men. Gorillas sometimes was used. So you hear the descriptions, and you have to kind of think about it in modern terms. So they're always talking about these things having shaggy beards and long hair. And again, you think of something, the depictions of these creatures, you know, with this long hair. Well, maybe to someone who's not familiar with the term Bigfoot, you're looking at this wild creature. What is it going to look like? You know, try to place yourself just for a moment in the shoes of those early settlers. You've never heard the term Bigfoot or Sasquatch. You know there are these mythical apes in other countries, on other continents. But what exactly is this that these people are seeing? Now this one is particularly interesting. I'm sure you guys will appreciate this because it's here in Arkansas. This is a quote from the Scientific American, March 1846. It says, "A monstrous wild man in the swamps about the Arkansas and Missouri line. His track is said to measure 22 inches and his toes as long as a common man's finger." But Scientific American, what does it tell us? We are of the opinion that either the wild man or the man who raised the story is a great monkey. Oh, the skeptics, they've always been around. So taking the scientific approach, Scientific American back at that time assures readers that no, this is a fabricated story, it's just something made up. You know, there's no wild man up there on the Arkansas-Missouri line. Remember, that's 1846. 1851, guess what? It's still being reported. And I haven't covered all the reports here. There are some in between. I'm just kind of hitting the highlights for you. 1851, the wild man is still on the loose, but now the skeptics have another answer. It's actually a survivor of the great earthquake that desolated the region in 1811. That's 40 years previous. This is what they tell us, that he was thrown helpless upon the wilderness by that disaster. It is probably that he grew up in his savage state, now bears only the outward resemblance of humanity. So, first the officials tell us, there's no such thing. There's no wild man up there, it's all fabricated. But people keep seeing it. So they need another solution, right? Okay, here's the answer. It's a feral kid. They didn't call it that, but that's what we're talking about. It's something that grew up in a feral state. So, it's just a human, grew up in the wild. Remember, this creature would have been at least, 45 maybe at this point. That's 1851. 1852, they're still reporting it. It's still on the loose. The description changes a little bit. Frightful appearance. 7 feet 2 inches high, completely covered with black hair, interspersed now and then with gray. I guess he was aging fast. Probably the stress of being an earthquake survivor. 7 feet high, but with all the shyness and habits of a completely wild animal. Oh, thank God they've explained it all. 1856, it's still on the loose. The description's changed. More people are still seeing it. Numerous travelers and hunters have asserted that they have seen him. Now he's described as a stout, athletic man. about 6 feet 4 inches in height, completely covered with hair of a brownish cast, about 4 to 6 inches long. How is this even the same creature? How is there only one? I think we all know the answer to that. Baxter County, 1938. We're still looking at the same general region. This is the state line up north. Anybody from Baxter County? Oh yeah, awesome. You guys know this story? I'll read it to you.
Is this one that happened in Colorado?
This is 1938. This is a 15-year-old boy who left a church social. He heard something walking behind him, and he turned around, saw a 7-foot-tall bipedal creature which proceeded to chase him. Thank goodness he came from church, because he was probably praying as he was running. Now, the news says that over the next several weeks, residents in the area heard blood-curdling screams echoing out after nightfall. Unnerved a lot of people in the region. This is a modern picture of Baxter County. That actually, I think, is a property for sale, and anybody has some serious cash to land. But you can see this dense wilderness, water, again, an area rich in resources. This particular trail is especially fascinating to me because I received a report from someone. Now, this gentleman told me that a relative of his had seen a creature that they referred to as a shaggy man. Now, this shaggy man was out in the woods. When they first spotted it, they believed that it was chasing another animal, possibly a deer. The creature stopped when it realized that they were watching it, and it turned and looked at them. They said it was taller than a normal man, with a long beard and hair all over. It was dark reddish in color. Now, this is a little bit more unusual. Typically these accounts you so frequently hear it was dark brown or it was black. So sometimes these descriptions come in with this reddish color, and you listen to this idea that it's kind of they called it a shaggy man, and it almost sounds orangutan-like. But they did say that it was a bipedal creature, and once it saw them watching it, it emitted this, there's the term again, blood-curdling scream. So guess what? They exited the area as quickly as possible. But again, this is incredible because we see this long pattern of tales from this region. And I didn't even go into native accounts from this area because there are plenty. But once you start looking at that trail, maybe it's just me. Sometimes I look at this stuff and I think, how can anybody think there's not something unexplained out there? You look at this wilderness, you look at all these reports for years and years and years, all the way back to native tradition. Smoke, there's fire, right? There's another similar case. This is near Anniston, Alabama, 1938. Wild man was spotted. This one, they said it ran on all fours when it got down and sped off. It would chase dogs. It was scaring farmers in the region, living in the dense swamp of the Chocoloco Valley. But this one was accompanied by a woman and a child who were both as savage in appearance and actions. So again, very much keeping in the same theme that we've been talking about today. That's a depiction or a picture of the valley, another region of vast, dense forest, prime territory once again. Just like the Arkansas case, I have a more modern account related to this one. Chocoloco Valley, Alabama, 1993. This gentleman saw a creature while he was out for a hike. It was the fall of '93. And this is his description. It looked like a very large monkey of some kind. It looked harmless, but it was unnerving to see something like that in the woods in Alabama. I know we're all thinking, I want to see something like that. This gentleman, he again exited the area very quickly. Now, he didn't say that it screamed when he was running away. He said that it made sounds that were more monkey or ape-like. that he heard echoing behind him. So it kind of shook him up quite a bit. I probably had just a couple of minutes I can take. You guys want to hear the Dismal Swamp story?
Yes.
So, 1981, the Great Dismal Swamp. Anybody familiar with the Great Dismal? No. Oh, wow. This is I encourage you to go on and look at photographs and just check this out. It's a very eerie, very strange place. It's not like the swamps you have in Louisiana or Arkansas. It's very unique. There are areas where you can't walk at all because there's so much water, but you can trek really far back in the swamp because there are dry areas. There's so much wildlife back there. Like I said earlier, lots of poisonous snakes, feral hogs. Those are probably the most dangerous thing because you'd hear this sound of something coming through the woods. And you better get out of the way. We typically would climb a tree or something because these things would just charge through and just, roll over anything that was in their way. And they got pretty sizable. And so there's a lot of strange stories associated with the Great Dismal Swamp. There's ghost stories. There's a story about a lost treasure. There's stories about different haunted places in the swamp. There's a cemetery that appears and vanishes. There's a couple of witch houses that are back in the swamp. And I spent a lot of time kind of tromping back there and looking for things. And honestly, the biggest danger was probably the moonshiners because you did not want to creep up on us still. That would be all she wrote. So I was trekking back in 1981, the fall of 81, and I was actually looking for one of these witch houses that I had heard legends about. I had made a couple of attempts to find it and finally had spoken to a gentleman who knew the story, told me pretty well how to get to it. So trekked way back in the swamp that day, had two friends with me, and found this witch's house. Really, it's kind of an old shack, creepy old place. And we spent some time inside. Had a couple of strange things happen, but that's another story. And it had taken us a while to find this thing. It's pretty deep in the swamp, so it's getting late. And as we came out, I was a little bit concerned because I suddenly realized that we've got a long trek back and it's going to get dark. I was always very good at navigating the swamp, whether it was a gift or dumb luck, I don't know, but I could always make it in and out of that swamp no matter how deep I went. And this particular occasion, I didn't say anything to these other two guys, just that we needed to move pretty quickly so we could get out of here and back to the vehicles. So we started trekking out of the swamp. It did indeed get dark, and was a full moon or close to it, so we had some natural light. And I had gotten used to following game trails and stuff, and pretty much knew different markers that I could see even in the dark. So we got part way back. We got to this area that was sort of an oval clearing, and I knew that we had to cut across this clearing very carefully and hit this one particular game trail that was on the other side, so that we'd have pretty much a clear shot beyond that. So I'm standing there for a couple of moments, kind of getting my bearings. The other two guys were just waiting. We had, incidentally, one flashlight, which my buddy had dropped conveniently coming out of the witch's house, so the thing it would work, intermittently. So I just told him to keep it, just for emergency or whatever. We're standing at the edge of this clearing, and I'm looking around, and I kind of crouch a little bit, and I'm looking, using the moon to look at the landmarks of the various trees and stuff, and I saw what I first thought was a pair of trees. And initially I thought, okay, we have to cut over there. And I'm looking at this pair of trees, and I'm thinking, no, I got to go more to the left. And I'm thinking, something's not right. And I focus on this pair of trees, and I'm just kind of staring at it. It's about 20 to 30 feet away. And I'm sort of following the line in the moonlight, and I suddenly realized what's unusual. One of the trees, it only goes up, 7 feet or so. I'm thinking, that's really odd. So I'm just staring straight at this thing, sort of fixed on it. And then I had a very chilling moment because I suddenly realized there was something else wrong. It was dead silent. I had spent so many days and evenings in that swamp. There was always night birds, insects, frogs, any number of animals making sounds, making night sounds. It was dead silent. And the hair kind of went up on the back of my neck. I locked on these two trees, particularly on the one that was only about 7 feet high, and I saw the top of it swivel. The moonlight caught this flash of eye shine. It was like a reddish orange. And then I heard this loud kind of huffing noise. And part of that tree, what I thought was a branch, dropped. So this creature, it had been standing beside a real tree, sort of holding it. And in the light, it looked like a pair of trees just kind of, against each other. Hear this loud huffing sound. This thing turns and it walks off away from us. I stood there for a moment. The other two guys were standing there. They're watching it. And I'm like, did you guys see that? And my one buddy goes, oh. And he could barely talk. The other guy just doesn't say anything. I'm like, we need to get going. So we get out, we make the rest of the trek out. We get to the vehicles, and at this point, it's important to emphasize, at that time, it's 1981, I wasn't even thinking about Sasquatch being in the Dismal Swamp. Because that period, you heard all these Bigfoot stories, but where did you hear them from? Pacific Northwest, the Himalayas. There was a few other accounts that I heard back then from reading things like Fate magazine and so forth. But for the most part, I'd never heard a Bigfoot story out of the Dismal Swamp. And my mind is trying to process all of this. And I told the guys when we got to the vehicle, I said, I don't want you guys, don't discuss this, don't say anything about what we've seen. Go home, write all this down, and let's talk about it tomorrow. Draw a picture to the best you can of what you saw. So this gets kind of interesting too, because I went home and did exactly that. The next day, I called my buddy Wes and I said, did you write all this out? Yeah, I got it, man. I kept trying to call the other guy, Mike, and then he's not answering. So, trying throughout the day, Wes and I got together and really wanted to compare notes to see if we all matched. Well, Wes and I, we had a description and a drawing that they matched. So now I was really fascinated to see what Mike's recollection was. We cannot reach this guy on the phone. We finally go to his house. We go in. He's sitting there watching television. And right now we want to talk about, what happened in the swamp last night. I don't know what you're talking about. We're talking about what we saw in the swamp last night. I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, he wasn't screwing around with us. He was very serious. He said, I don't know what you mean. We got into an argument. Wes got really angry. The three of us are kind of hollering. Mike's dad comes in the room. He says, "There's all this racket, is what I tried." Mike says, "These guys are trying to say I went out in the Dismal Swamp with them last night." His father looks at him and says, "Son, you did." He is so angry, he just storms out of the room saying that he didn't. He held on to that. This fellow experienced something that he just couldn't wrap his head around. And because of that, he just blocked it from his consciousness. He could not admit, he could not bring himself to talk about this sighting or the recall of this event. And that's, he never did come back around to it, unfortunately. He's passed away now. And never was able to come back around and grasp the fact that we had seen something so unusual, something that was outside of his comfort zone, outside of his level of perception, if you will. So that encounter, it was a big effect on me, and it led me to exploring more in the swamp, and specifically delving into these legends of these creatures in the Dismal Swamp. And I was able to talk to a lot of people who have had encounters with these creatures in that region. I I ended up talking to a lot of people who were moonshiners in the region. I had to drink a lot of stuff that probably should have been in a gas tank. You know, one particular family, I still feel bad about this to this day. One particular family you can't just walk in and say, hey man, you guys know anything about the creature tearing up your still? You don't do that. You know, you have to really be more graceful and just kind of make a connection and start talking to these people. So I started going and visiting this family that I met through a mutual connection. They were old moonshiners. They had been moonshiners in that region since like the 1800s or something. And these guys, man, they had stories. But every time I went over to visit them, you had to sit at the kitchen table and you had to drink some of their godforsaken shine. Don't get me wrong, give me some good moonshine, I'll drink it. But this stuff, oh. And I got a little bit clever because what I would do is I took a particular seat that was over near the window and there was a plant down there. And I just, you know, I'd take a sip of that and you know, I'd casually just lean back and dump some of that shine. After about 5 visits, that poor plant was dying. And like I said, I still feel bad about that. But some incredible accounts. And these guys, they never once called it a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. They had all these different names for it, you know, these swamp monkeys or, you know, yahoos, or like I said earlier, corn booger, you know, these creatures that would come in and, you know, there's stories of them shooting at these things and everything, but these creatures were not intimidated and they didn't like the stills back there, or maybe they just wanted to shine, like I said earlier. Anyway, that's my presentation. Some of my recent books, I've been working on this series on different states across the country. The 6th one just came out, Georgia, Peach State Monsters, and the 7th one is about to be announced. Don't come by the table and ask me when all 50 are going to be done. I'm doing pretty good. I've got a good portion of them out already, but each one of these books does have a huge section on Sasquatch. It also covers other creatures in the state. So if you see your home state up there, maybe you'd be interested in it. You can find more about me at my website, erielights.com, and that's what I got for you today.